thank you for having invited me to participate in the translation project. I don't know if everybody knows this, but this is a big collaborative project, this translation, and inviting me to talk tonight. It's a special honor to be here with Phil. I took a Greek tragedy course with Phil in 1976. We were reading Aeschylus's Agamemnon in Greek. But somewhat to my surprise, the first thing he asked us to do was to read it in English translation. And that sent a message to me, because after all, I think translation is one of the essential things for civilization. So this whole project of translating Euripides and having people reading this in translation is something I have never had a problem with. However, you made one mistake. You trusted us to do what you told us to do. The next class, we showed up, and not one of us had actually read the translation. So there are decades of students who have suffered under me because I insist that they have a quiz on the second week of classes to ensure that they read the translation. Because after all, if you don't get some big sense of what's going on with these plays, you can just be hopelessly lost in the Greek grammar. And we love Greek grammar, but you want to get the big picture too. So tonight I'm going to be talking more about the occasion of the performance of these plays in ancient Athens. It is, everybody knows who studies Greek drama, that the tragedies and comedies and satyr plays at Athens were performed at festivals of Dionysos. And perhaps if you only know one thing about Dionysus, it's that he is the god of wine. I've always liked this wall painting because you've got Dionysus embodying what he does for a job. He is encased in a cluster of grapes. In fact, the painting is so well done that there are experts who've looked at this and they think they know exactly the type of grape that it is. It's called the Aminia, apparently, one of the local varieties of grapes. That, over here, by the way, is Mount Vesuvius. That's one edge of it. Volcanoes are terrific for fertility, and that is going to apply for vineyards as well. So whenever you see a wine that comes from around Vesuvius or Mount Etna or something like that, it's worth giving it a shot. Not to say that you can't have good wines lots of other places too, but those are certainly worth paying attention to. One or two other things about this. He is carrying a ritualistic stick, thyrsus stick it's called. There's a panther down there. Dionysus was associated with certain animals in antiquity. So this idea of the world of nature is very much in tune with what he is up to. As far as wine goes, Dionysus was associated with the entire process. He would oversee the growth of vineyards. He would oversee the harvesting of grapes from those vineyards, the fermentation of grapes, and then finally the intoxication that would come as a result of what you drink after the wine is properly fermented. The drinking culture in ancient Athens was astonishing. Archaeologists are constantly finding more and more implements, or let's call them what they are, cups and mixing bowls and things like that, that the Athenians left behind for their drinking parties. Evidently, it was a huge part of their lives. When you read ancient legal texts, you discover that a fair number of legal problems arise because people are drunk. In these courtroom cases, you find that either the defendant or the plaintiff was at a party, they got drunk, they got into a fist fight, and next thing you know, they have a place in court. You're raising your hand. Okay. I thought maybe you were been taken to court for nothing like that. I understand you're going to the Museum of Fine Arts in a couple of weeks with UVM students. They have so many wine-related cups and craters and things like that at the Museum of Fine Arts that they have been able to devote an entire room to it. So drinking was big, and you can never forget that when you are looking at this. Okay, let's look at the next slide. What I've done here is to list the festivals of Dionysus at Athens. starting in October, going through March, April, that more or less covers the span of time that begins with the harvesting of grapes, fermentation, and then opening up the new wine in late March or so. I guess it was more like a Beaujolais Nouveau. The 2 or 3 months was all you needed for these things, and they were happy to do that. They didn't just have their wine sit around and age for years on end. I understand it's something to do with tannins. You guys might be the experts about that, but if the tannins aren't right, it's not going to age. And apparently a Beaujolais is just something you throw out if it's been sitting around for more than a few months. Well, that's what they had. So they just jumped into it. And they had a 3-day festival for drinking. They even had a contest to see who could drink the fastest. It was one of these occasions where all sorts of social norms were turned upside down. The first day was called the Pythagogia, which in Greek literally means the opening of the jars. So they had a celebration to open up this new wine that they had. The social life in the city was transformed. They were even willing to let the slaves out of work for the day so that they could participate. It was a real carnival-esque atmosphere. I suppose if we've got a parallel today, it would be Mardi Gras, where social norms are suspended, you can get away with things you would never otherwise get away with. And it's also tied into a ritualistic year. So that's part of the pattern for Dionysus. This is a ritual for him, that you would honor him by drinking. Sometimes I think it's redundant to speak of a festival of Dionysus because that's all he does. The word festival implies something special, a day where you set aside time to do something particular. But with Dionysus, it was 24/7, as far as I can tell. Still, the Athenians decided they had to institutionalize some of these things, and we've got 5 of them in Athens, which, as I say, corresponds with that period from harvesting the grapes up to pretty much the opening of the grapes in March or May. Nature, fertility, these are important themes in the cult of Dionysus. In the rural Dionysia, they had a very particular take on what fertility entailed. Let's look at the next slide. Now, I said that social norms were suspended. I don't think that they did this every day. This is only for special ritual occasions. It's like, this thing is huge. It's like a float at a parade. You couldn't even find a tape measure long enough, probably, to measure what this thing is. But it is indeed a phallus. Scholars are a little bit puzzled about the exact role of the phallic procession in Dionysiac rituals, because when you look at the mythology of Dionysus, the stories about him, it's not as if he's one of these gods who's always chasing after young women. In fact, there's an important article, a chapter about Dionysus called The Asexuality of Dionysus. It says something about the gods in Greek mythology, that it is a problem that he's not chasing girls all the time. He has Ariadne, and apparently he got a nymph pregnant at some point because he was presented with a child. But that's it. So the connection has to be not so much his personal behavior, rather it is something to do with the fertility of the earth being connected with fertility of human beings. And you can see an ivy, a cluster of ivy leaves right there, indicating this continuity between human and natural agricultural fertility. I understand that one aspect of the cult of Dionysus that's become clearer in the last 20 or 30 years, and this is because of archaeological discoveries, is that he was not just worshipped at Athens in these festivals, he was also worshipped by farmers. Everyday farmers would make offerings to Dionysus. These are not necessarily farmers with vineyards. You find little inscriptions, little offerings, and it turns out that he was a very popular god in the countryside as well as the city for these major festivals. Well, anyway, what we've got here is potency for nature. This is the god you would look to if you want to have potency. Aphrodite would pick it up from there. This is where Dionysus' job leads off and Aphrodite's begins. I think it is instructive to know that our word orgy comes from a Greek word, orgion, which refers to rites and is used to describe the rites of Dionysus. It's also instructive to know that our word enthusiasm comes from a Greek word, enthusiasmos, which literally means you have a god within you. And that's a word that turns up several times to describe specifically the rituals of Dionysus and what people are doing when they are celebrating what Dionysus has to offer. Another side of the worship of Dionysus is dancing. Let's look at the next slide. Talk about it. These are called Linnea vases. That's the name of one of the festivals. It probably doesn't have anything to do specifically with Linnea, but that's what they're called, so we're going to stick with that. I wanted to bring this up as an example of dancing. This is one way of honoring Dionysus, to join a group and dance. We've even got a tambourine here. I noticed one of our musicians has a tambourine. Was that intentional? Following Dionysiac precedent here. Good. I don't see, is that a oud, the stringed instrument? Okay, I don't see that, but we wouldn't expect that. Anyway, there are other instruments that they would be using back then. You know, the word comedy comes from a Greek word, komos, which describes something sort of like this: a dance, a revel. Believe me, those were not for water. That's where the wine was. They had a substantial part. It's also, before we move on, something you should also know about the wine in the ancient world was it's really, it was as potent as his fertility. You had to water it down, that wine. You would start by, sometimes, depending on what stage you are in a party, you might start by having your drinks be 1 part wine and 3 parts water. And as the evening wore on, a man who was the Thalessiarch would say, now we're going to do 2 to 1. And it wouldn't be as watered down. And as things got rowdier, you might go to 1 to 1 or something like that. If you just go to pure wine, you'll probably wind up in the morgue, from what I understand about this stuff. But they had to water it down. So they had these mixing bowls, praters, that they would use to get different distillations, the different differentiations of water in there. I want to make a point about dancing in Dionysus. One of the aspects of the cult of Dionysus that scholars have latched onto in the last few decades is that he represents the surrender of individuality. In other words, when you join into a dance, you become part of a collectivity, a group. Your identity is more being part of this group than it is being your own isolated individual. So this idea of a surrender of yourself to something bigger is a common motif in writings these days about Dionysus. Another etymology here. Phil had an etymology course he ran for many years, and you know these cold. Ecstasy. Ecstasy comes from a Greek word that referred to what happened in the cults of Dionysus. Literally, it means standing outside of yourself. So you are losing your identity, and you are standing outside of yourself. You're taking on some sort of new amorphous identity that connects you with other people. You could say that this is the point where the participants transport themselves into an alternative semi-magical reality, which is a phrase I stole from John. It's a little description of what I might talk about. So, next slide. I haven't talked about the theater yet. I only have 15 minutes. Try to keep it a little bit below that. In addition to wine, dramatic performances were a feature of 3 of these 5 festivals of Dionysus. They were, the big one was the city Dionysia. The Linnea, not quite as ambitious. The rural Dionysia was done in towns, in the countryside around Athens. As far as I know, the Helen was done at the city Dionysia in 412. I found one source that said that, but is that true? City Dionysia? Most of Euripides' tragedies were at the city Dionysia. I didn't see anything telling me that this one was not, so I assume that's the performance we're looking at. Late March is the appropriate time, and it's a little bit warmer in Greece these days, so they were able to get out and enjoy themselves in the theater. These were competitions. There would be, say, for example, 3 playwrights chosen to write tragedies and satyr play, and 3 playwrights were chosen to write comedies. One scenario was that you would have a tetralogy in the morning and then a comedy in the afternoon over the course of 3 days. And it must have been a lot of fun, but at the end of it all, a decision was made. There were judges who were watching all of these things, and they would give prizes. They would rank them, first, second, and third. One of the consequences of this, one of the implications of this, is that they only got to perform it once. Now, if I were in the cast and crew back there, and I were told that I'd be spending weeks rehearsing and blocking things out, the directors and the sound and all of this, going through all this trouble for a 2-hour performance, I think I'd be a little deflated. I spent 2 summers at the Champlain Shakespeare Festival 45 plus years ago. And in a way, it was great because we had opening night and we got that over with, and then we go for another 2 or 3, 4 weeks. And you really get it down. In fact, you have to be careful not to forget your lines after a point. So that's what I think of as the model for how a performance should work. If I were told that all I had was the opening night, that would be a disappointment. I say this partly because I understand this is not true last night, but opening nights were famously terrible. The audience that comes on opening night are people who were told that they should do this because it looks socially good, or somebody got a complimentary ticket, or they wanted to see their friends or something. They didn't really know that much about the play. They were laughing from wrong places. They weren't as receptive. And you can tell it when you're on stage. You can tell whether or not the audience gets it or not. So I understand last night's audience was terrific, but for me, the idea of only having an opening night and then closing it down just sounds absolutely awful. But that's what they did. There were re-performances sometimes, usually after the playwright was dead, so it wasn't very satisfying for that reason. Okay, 3 of these festivals have dramatic performances. Something about drama was Dionysiac. And it could be that idea of stepping into an alternative reality is part of it. Losing your identity, enthusiasm, things like that. That's not inconsistent with aspects of drama. Certainly Dionysus was seen as the god of drama. In Aristophanes' comedy Frogs, Dionysus goes down to the underworld to get the soul of Euripides, who has recently died, and try to bring him back to Athens. But while he's down there, he changes his mind and brings Aeschylus back up. So it's clear that Dionysus was intimately associated with drama. But before I go any further, I need to warn you that there is a recent revisionist school of thought about all of this that really questions whether or not this is just a coincidence. This association of Dionysus with drama and these performances. For one thing, the idea that an actor is involved in some ecstasy works on one level because they're stepping out of their personal identity and taking on another, but that's not usually the way it's described for the worship of Dionysus. Usually the word worship of Dionysus means you're leaving your individual identity not so much to take on somebody else's identity, but to take on a group identity. And that's not what happens. The idea of intoxication somehow fueling a dance might make sense. but the idea of intoxication being necessary for an actor, I'm not so sure. It requires a lot of discipline and memorization. It is hard work to pull this off. And I always have hats off to anybody who does this. My experience of being on stage was one of absolute terror. I hated it. And I decided that I was much happier sitting at a desk reading about it than trying to get actively involved in it. There's a scholar named Scott Scullion who used to teach at Union College. He's at Oxford. He's at Oxford now. Wrote an article about 15 years ago questioning whether or not there was anything Dionysian about drama. And the question specifically that he posed was, if you didn't already know that, for example, Euripides' Helen was performed at a festival of Dionysus, would you know? It's not always clear. He's gone through all of Greek tragedy, and he figured out that Zeus, Athena, and Apollo are invoked far more often than Dionysus is. Dionysus is actually a relatively minor figure in most Greek tragedy. There are exceptions, Euripides' Bacchae, for example, but in general, you would not know that this was something that was created for a Dionysiac festival. Scullion also points out that if you look elsewhere in the Greek world, you discover that not every city was using the festivals of Dionysus for their performances. He's got examples of festivals of Apollo, Athena, Hera, Zeus, and even Poseidon as the patron deities of dramatic festivals. So there's serious questions to be raised about exactly what's going on here. He even goes so far as to say that the theater of Dionysus is only where it is in Athens. I'm actually, while I'm thinking about this today, driving up, it occurred to me that what I should have done is come up with a little diagram of the theater of Dionysus at Athens to show you that the theater of Dionysus is in an awkward relationship to the temple of Dionysus adjacent to it. It's as if somebody really hadn't thought this out. Scullion suggests that the theater of Dionysus is where it is because it was an available location, and it was on a slope. And that's it. I think that's a little extreme, but it certainly would explain one of the anomalies. I have to tell you that I have had my own hand in this revisionist take on Greek drama. The book that I wrote about nature, culture, and the origins of Greek dramedy, Greek comedy that John mentioned, was specifically about animal choruses. Aristophanes wrote plays with titles like Birds, Wasps, and Frogs. And I spent years trying to pin down some kind of ritualistic origin for these. Remember I showed you the panther next to Dionysus? He is associated with animals. I just kept coming up empty-handed because the animals that turn up in comedy are not the animals that are particularly associated with Dionysus. And I came up with an alternative theory that I could call a secular theory, which is that these performances in comedy were not based on ritual, not even associated with Dionysus, but instead came out of dinner parties where people dressed up in costumes and acted out like strange foreigners or animals or other critters like that. So far the reviews have been good, but the point is, there's a big open question here about exactly what the relationship is between Dionysus. I'm going to drop the revisionist part and go back to the old view that there is something, because I think there is something to the connection between drama, tragedy, and comedy and Dionysus. And that brings us to the next slide, which is an old slide. You've seen this. What I did not talk about was that in the middle. It is not a statue of Dionysus. Look carefully, it's more like a scarecrow. It's on a stick. Turns out it's some kind of a costume. So you have the outfit there, and that is a mask. And it looks pretty convincing, but we've got a number of other vases like this where it is crystal clear that however convincing it may be here, however authentically, organically human or divine it looks here, These are masks that are being worshipped. And that's, I think, one place where that's something you can't get away from. Dionysus is the god of masks. And what do masks do? They help you leave your own identity, maybe not merge into a group identity, but take on a separate identity. And that is exactly what actors are doing. They're supposed to pretend to be or appear to be somebody that they are not. Well, let me just close by saying that I think the rules are different for an audience. For an audience, we don't have to take on a false persona. We can afford to clap for the performers and get involved in the drama that they're doing. We can afford to experience ecstasy if we want to when we're sitting in the theater over here, or enthusiasm if we want to. So I'm going to finish simply by saying then that I look forward to my enthusiasmos when this play starts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken Rothwell, Professor of Classics at UMass Boston.
Any questions? Yeah.
Did women get as drunk as men?
Did women get as drunk as men? I think yes. In fact, there were women known as Maenads who were specifically women who worshipped Dionysus. And not only would they probably get as drunk, but they would get even more violent. Or at least in myth, they did. It was, that seemed to be available to everybody.
Even though the weather in Athens isn't what it is here in January, were they really watching plays in stone amphitheaters in the winter?
Apparently so. I've been in Athens in January, and it'll hit 60 during the day. And if you're in the Theater of Dionysus, which is sort of enclosed on one side of the Acropolis, if you've got a warm cloak, probably not so bad. However, at that January festival, they didn't expect people from other cities to come visit. It was just for the Athenians. By the time you get to late March, the sea lanes are opening up, travel was happening, and they got much bigger audiences. So it did affect the audience size.
It's also during the day in a southern exposure, so that might help. Not in the evening like yours.
Yeah, like this is all outdoors. This is outdoors, and it's a that's a south-facing slope of the Acropolis. So the real question is, or the issue might be, the fact that they would never do it in the summer because the sun would just bake them like fish. Anything else?
So I noticed that you had the rural Dionysia and the city Dionysus. So there would be a festival out in the country and a festival in town?
Yes, one in the country and two in the town. Yeah. The rural Dionysus seems to have been the bodier one. The AWD. That's the one where they had the phallic procession.
Oh, okay.
I wish we knew more about exactly what was being performed at which festival. They may have used the rural Dionysia for essentially dress rehearsal in some cases, more local control. Somebody's getting a play ready for the Linnea or the city Dionysia, sort of going on the road.
What they still do in New York.
Exactly. Yeah. It comes to Boston.
Yeah, then New York.
Quickly so used to.
But we were just talking today about how these tunes and the words are known by people. They quote them. And so there's this one-time performance, but it must have been the case that it leaked because you must have had rehearsals where they'd hear the song and then the chorus members must have gone to parties and re-sung it because they were like popular songs that people could quote. And with one performance, no matter how good your memory is, it's not going to sink in quite as well.
Well, we know that scripts were starting to circulate by the end of the 5th century. And we also know from centuries after that songs, odes, would be detached from the manuscripts or papyri of the dialogue and exist independently, sometimes with musical accompaniment, in fact. So they could take on a life of their own written, but we always need to remember that this is a culture where people weren't necessarily able to read at all. They were memorizing things. They could remember them. And that might be part